On Midway itself, most of the planes were off the ground when the Japanese struck, and a heavy anti-aircraft barrage helped to keep the runways unharmed. Although there was a lot of damage, as the Japanese fighter pilots turned back to the carriers, they radioed that a second strike was necessary if Midway was to be taken. It was at this point that Admiral Nagumo, the victor of Pearl Harbor, made a decision that was to turn the course of the battle. He had expected that the first attack on Midway would be sufficient, so he had kept his reserve planes ready to ward off an attack from the American fleet. But his reconnaissance planes had not sighted the American fleet at all, so Nagumo now changed his instructions to his bomber crews. They were to unload the torpedoes that they carried to fire against ships and load bombs to drop on Midway. But as they did this, and as the planes stood defenseless on the decks of the carriers, the American fleet came within striking range. At first, the Japanese shot the Americans out of the skies. But later, as further attacks mounted, the Americans were successful.
Torpedo Squadron 8 was in the thick of it. Of these men, only one survived, Ensign Gay, who became a national hero after the battle. Today, he's a captain for TWA. What were his most vivid impressions of this decisive encounter?
My first concern was the Zeros that were strafing me in the water. So each time they would come down, I'd dive to get away from them, and, well, it was just trying to survive.
Within 4 minutes, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers were out of action. Now there was only one Japanese carrier left in the battle, the Hiryu. It sent its last aircraft to sink the Yorktown. The Yorktown was already rudderless and listing. The deck was a mass of twisted metal. Fire raged everywhere, but now the final attack from the Hiryu's planes made the end inevitable. Yorktown was soon avenged. The Enterprise sent 40 planes to find the Hiryu, the last Japanese carrier, and destroy it.
I saw it all. I was right in the middle of the whole thing. A matter of fact, some of the ships were close enough so that if there had been someone on it that I knew, I could have recognized it.
So all the time you were in the water, you were completely surrounded by Japanese?
Oh, yes, quite a few. And I saw their ships taking them off of their carriers, and their carriers were burning. And, of course, their airplanes then, right about this time, had come back from Midway, and they were all having to land in the water because their carriers were burning.
When Admiral Yamamoto first heard the news, he decided to send reinforcements to the battle. But when he learned that all 4 Japanese aircraft carriers had been lost, he pulled his forces back. He had taken on the American Pacific Fleet and been beaten. 6 months of victories were over. The Japanese flood had been stopped. Now began the long push back. The 7th of August, 1942, Guadalcanal. From here, the Japanese menaced all American lines of communication in the South Pacific. A young Marine, Edwin Morgan, was there.
I personally was afraid that I would be afraid, not do my job. There was a great deal of confusion. The first night some units fired at each other. And there was the strangeness of finally seeing the Japanese. They were strange, they were Asian. We were keen, and we had the morale was certainly very high. We weren't as well trained as we thought we were, but we were confident. There was a great deal of confusion. The maps were bad. There was confusion as to the names of the rivers and the distances. For instance, we were told that we must take Mount Austin, which is miles away and 2,000 feet high, the first day. It wasn't taken for months.
Henderson Field proved to be the key to the battle for Guadalcanal. The Japanese sent in an elite unit of the Imperial Marines to recapture it, led by one of the heroes of Singapore, Colonel Ichiki.
They decided to come around through the jungle and come down this ridge, which leads straight to the airport. There's no obstacle between this ridge and the airport and the sea. It's about 1,000 yards long, covered with kunai grass, and on either flank are the valleys of the Lunga River and the Tenaru River. It's a sort of a door to the airport. They attacked on the evening of the 12th, aided by a bombardment of Japanese cruisers at sea, which plastered the ridge. Then they came on in the usual way, almost shoulder to shoulder, all night long. They found here 400 men under Colonel Edson of the Raider Battalion, which suffered heavily but held. There were more than 700 Japanese dead. They were all dead because the wounded refused to surrender. This is the first taste we had of the Japanese method of fighting to the last man. And when our corpsmen approached them to try and help the wounded, they'd explode grenades in their faces, killing themselves and the corpsmen. It was about this time that the campaign began to we began to become as savage as the Japanese in self-defense. It became practically a fight of extermination. No quarter, no mercy. It's also about this time that disease set in. Dysentery, malaria increased from week to week. Fatigue. We were living in the jungle. We were dirty most of the time. Fighting was more or less constant. The bombardment was constant. We began to realize it was going to be long, hard, and brutal.
Then came a stroke of luck for the United States that set the seal on the fate of Japan. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the victories in the Pacific, the leading Japanese strategist, decided it was time to take a personal appraisal of the worsening situation. He was in control of an immense front based on hundreds of tiny islands, any of which might be the next target. He flew from base to base. On the 17th of April, 1943, he left Rabaul, heading southeast for the Solomon Islands. The Americans knew his exact location. They had intercepted the Japanese radio signals, and from Guadalcanal, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters took off to intercept Yamamoto. They caught him above Bougainville, well inside Japanese territory. His plane was unescorted. The American fighters were too fast for the bomber. An era in the history of Japan was ended. It was Admiral Yamamoto who had said, "I will give you 6 months of victories, but then I can promise nothing." Japan had enjoyed greater victories than any in its history, but as the ashes of Yamamoto were ceremoniously put to rest, Japan's victories were over. Yamamoto must have realized it before his death. The war was over for Yamamoto, but not for Japan. For the Shinto priests, for the dignitaries of the court, for Prime Minister Tojo, and for 80 million Japanese, the war would continue.
15 major battles of the Second World War. Their impact was enormous and decisive. See newly released documentary footage on the dramatic encounters in the Atlantic and the Pacific. See the great historical battles in Russia, the Normandy landing, the bombing of Berlin, the invasion of Italy. See the big battles of World War II, the fateful encounters upon which hung the destinies of men and nations. See the big battles.